Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I can assure you what you'll hear here is a lot more exciting than what's going on out there. So thank you so much for coming. I know it's late in the day, so very, very pleased you're here. My name is Andrea Mainelli. I'm a senior advisor at Tyton Partners, an education strategy consulting firm. And I'm joined today by some amazing people from the world of social emotional learning. We are going to talk today about one of the most pressing issues facing educators and students at schools and districts today: the social and emotional state of our students, our educators, and the challenges they've faced because of the stress of COVID, the fight for racial injustice, and the other disruptors going on in our world, which you know are many. I'm pleased to introduce, starting to my left, Dr. Roberta Scott. She is the head of social emotional learning at Houston ISD. David Adams, the CEO of Urban Assembly, and Dr. Aaliyah Samuel, who was recently appointed the president and CEO of CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic and Social and Emotional Learning. We're going to talk today about what's going on the front lines, and we are going to talk about politics, and we're going to talk about them in a respectful and friendly way, but this is a really important topic in the field of social and emotional learning. I'm just going to start with a couple of stats and explain my role. I am with Tyton Partners, and we collaborated with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and CASEL on 2 studies that really laid out the state of the field of social and emotional learning. We started in 2019, pre-COVID, and we surveyed educators, and we also surveyed providers, some of whom are probably in the audience today. We then repeated the study last year when COVID was well underway, and the results that we saw pre and post-COVID were quite startling. We observed a lot of dramatic changes. Students' mental health and their social and emotional competencies went way up the charts in terms of what educators were worried about. Prior to COVID, really academics were first. Now social and emotional competencies are pretty much first. Diversity and equity and inclusion rose. We found that 95% of districts expect to spend as much, if not more money than last year, this year. And we also identified that the market is about a $735 million market. When we did it in 2019, there was about $500 million of spend. Significant increase. We have estimated that this is now about a $1 billion market. And I have to express it in money terms. We all really care about the outcomes and the impacts on students. It is about what schools are spending, what they're choosing to spend it on, and how they prioritize. So that's laying the groundwork. There are some really favorable tailwinds in terms of social and emotional learning rising in importance, but there's also some headwinds. And to talk about the state of the union in social and emotional learning, I'm going to first turn to Dr. Samuel to start us off.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, it's interesting even using the term state of the union, particularly as we talk about education and social emotional learning. And really how I like to phrase this is that really what we're hearing and seeing is a tale of 2 stories. And you might say, well, what do you mean by that? So I want to start with, first and foremost, the realities for what practitioners, parents, students. And when I say practitioners, I mean holistically school personnel, whether you are a bus driver, an office manager, a classroom teacher, principal, superintendent, those who touch children within a school setting. And also, most importantly, the students. And one of the things we know and have seen firsthand is that social emotional learning and those needs they are ever present now, more than 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And it's manifesting itself in different ways. And depending on the audience, meaning if you're talking to a parent might say, gosh, I just don't understand what's happening with my kid. They can go from 90 to nothing in a moment. Or they melt down crying. Or they're so anxious that I just don't know what to do. That's social emotional learning. That's what we're talking about, those emotions. If you talk to a teacher, they can say, God, I am managing so many different behaviors. At one point, I could, my kids knew how to raise their hand. They knew how to talk to a classmate. And they're working on the behaviors and the skills that once were far easier, or at least more present. But then you also talk to superintendents and principals, and they're talking about the social emotional needs of their teachers and the adults in the building, because they also are struggling as well. They're dealing with all the realities of the pandemic. So And when we talk about need, it is showing up more now than ever. I often go back to a visit that I did in Charlotte, North Carolina. I had an opportunity to talk to a veteran teacher, over 35 years, veteran teacher. And she said to me, Dr. Samuel, you know, we've returned to school, but we haven't returned to learning because we haven't returned to the relationships. And the power of the relationships on not only bringing kids back, but helping with those academic gains. So social emotional learning is real, it's present. That's the reality on the ground. But then you fast forward or turn your attention to what the discourse politically and nationally, and what you'll hear is social emotional learning is a Trojan horse for something else. Critical race theory and SEL. And you're hearing SEL or social emotional learning being politicized in a way that we've also never seen before. And a large part of it is because there's a political target. We have seen with the pandemic how up front and center education has been. Everybody now has an opinion on education, even those who feel like because they were once a student, now they're an education expert. And every politician, whether you are a governor, a state legislator, a mayor, there's two platforms, workforce and education. And education plays into both the workforce and also the realities of education. And SEL has become, in some sense, the boogeyman when we talk about it politically. And I'm often asked, you know, Aaliyah, is SEL being unfairly politicized? Yes, it is being unfairly politicized. And the reason being is we know from hearing the Surgeon General yesterday, the realities of what young people are going through with mental health challenges, anxiety. When you look at the #1 Googled item or TED Talk right now by adults, it's how to manage and deal with stress and anxiety. These are the skills that we're trying to teach young people, and young people now coming out of a pandemic. Also, social emotional learning has often been an approach to addressing different pandemics throughout the US history. When we had the opioid pandemic, guess what was in the federal bill to help address the opioid pandemic? Social emotional learning. When we talk about gun violence and trauma, what was in those bills and legislation? Social emotional learning as an approach. Like, this is not new. It has always been bipartisan or nonpartisan, depending on whatever term you use. But because of how divisive politics have become, and also how front and center education is now more than ever, it has become the political pawn. Fast forward to the midterms, which we are all either looking forward to or terrified of, depending on where you live. And here's what we're up against. There's 36 gubernatorial elections. There are over 435 legislative seats up for grabs. We have at least 8 state chiefs, education chiefs, that are up for election. What is happening right now and what we are on the horizon of, education and those of us that are in the field, have to be paying attention to this midterm more than any other midterm. Yes, midterms of this magnitude happen every 4 years, but not post-pandemic and not when you have the realities that we're seeing. So we absolutely need to be paying attention to this midterm. In addition, as we talk about and look towards the future, June through August is when many of these states will clear primaries. We need to be paying attention to how these candidates are talking about education holistically, but we're also very much prepared that SEL or social emotional learning will be on the ballot or some kind of campaign platform to some degree. But here's what we also need to pay attention to. It doesn't matter what audience or how we're talking about SEL, we're essentially talking about the same things. Parents are talking about the social skills, the play dates that were missed, the proms that were missed, the sports activities that were missed. Teachers are talking about it from using the term social emotional learning, how it impacts the classroom. We're hearing the workforce saying, we don't have enough young adults who are transitioning in the workforce that can work in teams, that can understand different perspectives, who understand how to take direction or who have initiative. So when you peel all of that back, we're fundamentally dealing with the same challenge, whether it's early childhood, K-12, you're seeing it on college campuses. We recently heard about the soccer player at Stanford who, you know, God bless her family, she took her own life, and there are so many questions. And so it doesn't matter the age bracket that we're talking about or whether it's workforce or education, the commonality is the impact socially and emotionally and how it's playing out. And so There's, some politics, whether you like it or not, that we're going to have to play in. And there's also some political cover that we're going to have to provide for our practitioners who are trying so desperately to meet the needs of our students, both academically and also from a social emotional learning perspective.
Well said, and thanks for that overview. And if we take it from the State of the Union down to one of those educators who's been working many years in this field in one of the largest districts in the country, Dr. Scott, what's it like on the ground, and what have you been through in your journey in the district and implementing social and emotional learning?
So good afternoon, everyone. Basically, we started this work in Houston Independent School District in 2017. I returned back to the district. So this is about my 18th year. And so I started off with a team of 9, and I oversee currently the social emotional learning, psychological services, and student discipline. We have just a little bit under 200,000 students and 280 campuses. So with a team of 9 in 2017, I'm happy to say, as of date, I'm about 49 employees with vacancies of about 25 that I'm trying to staff for. We have made a lot of gains, but we've utilized the data and what the data has told us, and in any opportunity that I have to get in front of the higher hands that be, I present the data, the day-to-day data. And so starting off with a small team, we have now went from about 4 initiatives up to 52. And so those initiatives range from, we launched a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week hotline where students could call in and get counseling support. And so I do have a plethora of expertise on my team. So I have psychologists, I have LSSPs, LPCs, LCSWs, school counselors, teacher behavior specialists that provide different types of services, tiered services to our campuses. And so a lot of the things that we do to promote areas for social and emotional learning is to provide professional development for our teachers, because we know that our teachers you can't pour from an empty vessel, right? And it has to, we always say student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change. And we utilize that as we go into our campuses. And a lot of times our teachers and our building principals say, can you just fix this student? And I'm like, well, we're gonna fix the adults first. And so we have focused on a lot of programs. So we have the adult SEL, because we did take a hit prior to the pandemic, but the numbers have increased, right? And so we get just as many calls as in response to adults that we have to respond to, in addition to students. I'm saddened to say that last week I had a student suicide completion at our high school. And this has been probably number 3 this year, but even over the course of me being in this role in the creation of the department, I've probably had over 13. And so for a district this size, that's probably a small number, but that's still, no one wants to hear that. So we put a lot of things in place to support our teachers first, around what does that look like? Youth mental health first aid. We do mindfulness. We even launched where teachers could actually log on and get breathing techniques in real time. So then when we're on campuses, we're working with the teachers and we're also working with the students. We have, last summer, we launched a K9 therapy program. So we bring our pets. We purchased 2 pets for our, when we have school-wide, such as what transpired last week. And so they go in and do comfort animal treatments. We focus on working with our students with self-regulation. We coach our teachers around co-regulating those behaviors. We offer trainings around de-escalation, trauma-informed practices, restorative discipline practices. You name it, we do it. And so we have made a lot of leverage just based on the data. So when we get calls in, we track all of the work that we're doing. So unfortunately, we get a lot of calls for suicide ideations. So that's what keeps me busy on Saturdays, Sundays, and I tell people all the time, I work 8 days a week, 36 hours a day. But I have a great team now that I'm able to breathe just a little bit, but we still have a lot more. With the 52 programs, we launched the Education First, which is for substance abuse. So that was one of our, so I'm over student discipline as well. And one of the things, we're the gatekeepers for the Student Code of Conduct. So we kind of write policy, but not really. I oversee it, but I'm not the policy maker, but I can sway a lot of the things that have taken place. So that was one of the programs that I initiated, and that has been monumental in terms of our students that are struggling with drugs. And so we have something for them. So instead of removing them, we put them into a program, and there's support that is provided, and we were able to get that board approved along with some other things. One of the main things that I want to mention is that we started what was a pre-K to ban on suspending our kids back in 2017 and in the Houston Independent School District. Well, the following year, the state of Texas decided that they were going to ban it across the state of Texas. And so that's the type of work that we're doing in Houston.
Thanks, Dr. Scott. And I think, you just heard the story of what tenacity, tremendous effort, as Dr. Scott said, using data, bringing expertise, I'm sure cajoling, convincing, but I think you've probably won the district over that this is worthwhile, and that, as you said, personnel and spending are going up.
Oh, yes.
Which is great.
And I'm still advocating as well.
Of course, and I can't say that's true everywhere, but we're going to turn to David, who, as CEO of Urban Assembly, his work spans multiple districts. And so I want to get an idea from you of, what's working, what's not in districts that don't have the personnel capacity and expertise that Houston benefits from right now.
Yeah, I don't know that anybody has the personnel capacity and expertise that Houston has right now. So God bless you, Dr. Scott. Obviously, Dr. Samuels is doing great work at the head of CASEL. And so I just want to go back to some of the comments that my colleagues made here. They talked about social emotional skills being included in criminal justice bills, and substance abuse bills, and bills to reduce the amount of teenage pregnancy. And the question is why? Right? Why would one set of skills cover such a diverse content in the federal government and other spaces? And the answer is social problem solving. All right, we're talking about how we equip young people to solve problems within themselves and interpersonally. And I have talked to folks in Virginia, South Carolina, I talked to folks in Texas, and I said, we want our young people to graduate our schools being able to make decisions in line with their intent and solve the kinds of problems that help us be in community, all right? Now, there are folks out there, I'm not gonna name the names, but there are folks, all right? There are folks who would give that up. They would give up their children's ability to live in community, to solve intrapersonal problems. They would give that up to win an election, right? To get that one more vote across the finish line. And so what we're seeing when we're going around in the Urban Assembly is the way we combat that, the way we address this, is to be so clear about what we are trying to do. Clarify, 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 right? When we go in and we use language, we say, how are your young people currently developing the ability to problem solve and make good decisions? And people will say, I'm not doing SEL. Right? We don't do SEL programs. And yet, regardless if you do SEL programs, you're impacting the social and emotional development of your young people. The question is, how? Is it for the positive? Is it for the negative? And we are talking about increasing the intentionality of that work. All right, so in the work we're doing over here with Dr. Green, where's Dr. Green? All right, shout out to Dr. Green over in New York City, right? We're thinking about how can we help schools in New York City cohere their work around mindfulness and their programs and restorative practices under a common framework of social and emotional learning so that folks understand that conflict resolution skills that you may be using in your restorative practices are the same things that you can develop proactively, not just for conflicts in schools, but for conflicts in general. And those are the same kind of conflict resolution skills that we need to see in our adults in Congress, in our adults in school boards, in our adults in our lives. So those are the skills that you teach, not just to reduce discipline issues, but to help folks be in community. Now, when we go and we're looking at things like behavior management supports, things like PBIS, right, we're hoping folks understand that you are creating conditions for decision-making to be pro-social. We're not creating compliance of young people. We are helping create behavioral structures so that they can make decisions in line with being in a community. So across the country, the key thing I think for us has been clarity and getting those language so clear that folks are looking at us and saying, that makes sense. I'm not willing to deprive my child. I'm not willing to deprive my student of ability to do the things that they need to do in terms of solving problems and being in community. And that's, I think, what we need to focus on. We're not gonna focus on the politics. We're not gonna focus on the challenges. I mean, I'll say one lesson before I turn it over, right? If we think about politics as the way in which our communities have developed the systems to pursue the common good across different values, right? It's politics. I believe one thing, you believe another thing, right? Schools have always been political. Right?
Yes, it has been. Yes, it has been.
That's how it is, right? From Brown versus Board of Education to the Scopes monkey trials to desegregation in North. Schools are where we define our values as Americans. And so if we're gonna be political about it, let's get it. Let's, Dr. Sandler says, let's lean into this moment. Let's define the values about what young people we wanna produce and how we're gonna use our schools to help those outcomes become the way we wanted to produce our young people, and I'm not afraid of that. I'm excited to have that opportunity. If people did it before us, we're gonna do it now, and that's how we're gonna move forward.
That's great. Thanks, David. I'm not going to let you off the hook, though, because I want you to take us one layer deeper and describe some of the programs, for example, what you're doing with New York City at a level that people can really get their hands around it.
I appreciate it. So in New York, we are supporting about 1,800 schools, which is 100% of New York City public schools. And we are helping define what social emotional learning is. So we're partnering with assessment companies so that students receive feedback on their social emotional skills. Now, there'll be folks who say, I don't want to assess social and emotional learning. I will tell you here today, there is no question that the primary driver for learning is effective feedback. It's effective feedback. Have people mess that up? Yes, okay? I agree. But we don't throw out the baby in the bathwater because some people mess it up. We get better, all right? So yes, we are investing in assessment because we know feedback matters. And when young people see that we are taking time to give them feedback on things that are not just math and science, they start to feel like, man, I can come here with my entire self. They say, I can be not just a student, but a person because that's the people we're teaching and that's who they're learning from us. So that's the first thing. Creating common assessments so that folks can drive feedback in ways that make sense. Secondly, right, we can't scale content. We got 1,800 schools, 1.1 million kids, 75,000 teachers, right? We trained about 72,000 of those teachers. We identified about 1,800 social and emotional leads, developed a 13-hour training for them, deployed that training, certified those folks. Every school is different. So we don't scale content, we scale processes. Right? The question is, what kind of processes do schools need to engage in to organize around these principles of social emotional development? And that means it's a question and a problem set that the schools are working on, that the superintendencies are working on, and we're not pushing in the answers. We're creating that common problem set so they can learn from each other using a common framework. And that framework is social and emotional development for young people in New York City and across the country.
I'm going to ask this question on, to the both of you and Dr. Samuel, to you as well. What if parent, how hard was it to get parent buy-in? I mean, this, obviously, I'm a parent, and I can tell you there were many times over the last 2 years where, even in a relatively calm household, I was at the end of my rope. Like, Dr. Scott, where were parents in that 5-year journey with you, and what are they saying now? They're the ones who are going to vote, so.
So we launched what were called parent universities, and we still have those. And so social and emotional learning was embedded into that component. And so every time a campus or we have areas. And so if one of the areas was hosting a parent evening, parent meeting, or what have you, there was a representative from the social emotional learning team there to provide, here are the resources, here are the things that are available to you, but here are the things that are available for your child. Here's some of the things that are available on your campus. We also, in alignment, we offered that 24-hour, 7-day-a-week hotline. We also opened it up eventually to parents as well. We created an app it was for principals, and then we created another app for our parents. And so they were able to see, like in real time, what are some of the things that I can just tap onto in regards to social and emotional learning. What is social and emotional learning? And so we were able to really educate them, over-communicate, and over-communicate every opportunity that we could in order for them to understand this is what we do, this is why we're here, and this is how it's going to support your child.
So interesting. Other comments?
Yeah, I think I'll approach this in a couple different ways. So for CASEL's been around 25 plus years, and CASEL they are the ones who coined the phrase social emotional learning, and we have a CASEL wheel. And in that CASEL wheel, it has not only the competencies, but parent engagement has been at the core of it, along with community engagement. And really, to do SEL well, this cannot be done in a vacuum, and it cannot be done just within the school setting. So one of the things we're trying to emphasize is not only the ongoing history that we have of having parent and community engagement at the core of it, but also using this year to really reemphasize the importance of parent, school, and community partnership, because really that is how SEL happens well, as has been pointed out. Like, we can't do this in isolation, nor should we pretend to. So I think that's one thing to really note. The second is elevating parent voice. As we have really started to engage in this national discourse and try to address the misinformation, having parents have a seat at the table and talk about what their experiences are. Because one of the things we know is that when parents stand up, politicians back down. And so what part of the problem is, parents aren't as informed in some of the education speak that I know I'm guilty of as an educator. I often use my parent friends as test cases. I have a 7 and 11-year-old, and many of my cohort of friends have kids similar ages. So I'm like, do you know what social emotional learning is? And they're like, Aaliyah, half the time we don't even know what you do. So what are you talking about? So being able to talk to my own parental friends and say, how do you see this? What messages really resonate with you and what's going on in your household? And there's a real opportunity to elevate the voice and the need of parents and align it with the education speak and the realities that we know teachers, school personnel, they're seeing. So I think there's multiple ways. We are also looking at partnerships with some of the national parent representing organizations like the PTA, other groups that really talk to large groups of parents. But it's not just parents, to your point, that we have to convince, because the majority of voters are actually not parents of school-age kids. The majority of voters are those who don't have kids. But what they reflect on, and we actually had a meeting on this earlier, is most people reflect to their own school experience. And so they vote from that lens of what their school experience is. And just looking at the base of this crowd, not being judgmental, I think we're all close in age. And education has changed quite a bit in 20 years. I think about my experience and what my kids are doing. 90% of my kids right now, even my 7-year-old, it's online. In person, they have a teacher, but they have a computer. So, education has fundamentally changed. And so how do we make sure we're not only bringing parents along, but making sure that they're at the core of the process? And most of the districts who are doing social emotional learning well, or have really strong systemic approaches to social emotional learning in their districts, have included parents in the process from day one, from the curriculum they select, from the approach they select. I see nodding heads of my educators, which always makes me feel good because I know I'm on target. But fundamentally, and that's how it should be, parents should absolutely be at the table. And from our perspective at CASEL, we've encouraged that from day one.
Yeah, I can speak briefly on this. So New York City is a big place. And we have mayoral-controlled schools. one of the things that we could have done better in the rollout was managing our work with our parents. We were constrained by timelines. We started out with an 18-month timeline, and then I got a call, and they're like, surprise, it's 12 months, and I got a call, they're like, hey, it's gonna be 3 months, and I was like, all right, man, let's work it out. So that created tension points, right? That created constraints, and we spent a lot of time on then the back end having to work with miscommunication and misinformation that parents had, on the one hand, about using assessments and measuring students' mental health, which we weren't doing. On the other hand, folks feeling like their kids weren't getting enough. And so, I think in the real world, which I live in, we do the things that we need to do to get the job done. And having spent time with these parent groups now, and spent a lot of time on Zoom, folks are very deeply engaged in this notion of supporting kids around their problem solving. And I remember they said, man, David, if you had told us this, I wouldn't have written that op-ed, or I wouldn't have tweeted that tweet, right? We wouldn't have pushed back against this the way that we did. So I think the lesson for us is we need to engage our parents, and we need to engage our parents with clarity. We have to do the jobs that we have to do. I wasn't willing to not get the job done. But now we're going back, we're repairing the damage, and I would wish that we didn't have to do that. But life is what it is. So at the end of the day, clarity, Dr. Samuel talked about it. Nobody cares about big terms like meta-analyses and social emotional constructs. We got to talk about skills, because that's what we're teaching. Embedded in those skills are attitudes, right? How do we develop them? And then how do we relate those things to the things that parents are already doing? So tell me what this looks like in your home, right? How do you teach decision making? What does that look like in your house? When your child gets upset, what are some things that you do? Well, in schools, here are the things that we're working on. How can we work together so that your young person has a consistent kind of understanding of what we care about and what you care about? So I would say that in terms of what we could do better and what we're going to be doing moving forward.
Well, what will be interesting is to see if the industry can coalesce around this simplification of language. I mean, Dr. Samuel was quoted in a news article, is it as simple as changing the vocabulary? I wish it was, that we could change the label and convince politicians, voters who are not parents, who maybe aren't as close to the issue. But there are challenges ahead, and I'm going to pivot to my last tough question for each of you is, what's the call to action? We have policymakers. This is a complicated issue. We have policymakers, we have funders. Right now we are, relatively speaking, awash in money, and some of it's being directed at SEL, but that may go away. We have educators themselves, and we have providers, some of whom are in the audience, who are reacting, trying to provide real-time changes to their products and services to meet the needs of districts. Dr. Scott, let's start with you. What's your call to action, and who is it to?
Well, for me and the work that I lead is definitely for our educators, our teachers, our boots on the ground, those individuals, really educating them so that they have the tools and the capacity to be able to do the things that they do. I think that we have focused a lot on academics in terms of professional development. I tell my building principals all the time, when a kid can't teach, we do tutorials when a kid can't read, we do a lot of tutorials for reading. When they can't do math, same thing. But when a student cannot behave, what do? We put them out of school. We have to equip our teachers with the skills to be able to teach. So that students can practice and then have the replacement behavior and be reinforced. So those opportunities, creating that platform so that teachers are able to do the things that they need to do in regards to helping students create those skills for self-awareness, social awareness, relationship building, self-regulation, emotional. We're seeing a lot of emotional dysregulation. What do? A lot of our teachers, they really don't know. And so we're equipping those individuals with the tools that they need in order for them to be successful.
All right, I hear it loud and clear. Professional learning. All you providers out there, make sure you're doing it. Make sure you're doing it well and cost effectively. David, how about you? What's your call to action?
Yeah, you said it was going to be a hard question, but this is not a hard question, right? Because we know exactly what we have to do. We need to be courageous. We need to stand up for what we know is right, because we're talking about the character of our society. right? We're talking about what kinds of schools are we organizing and what kind of young people are we graduating from those schools who are gonna be the citizens, who are gonna be the wives and the husbands and the brothers and the sisters, and they need to be incorporated and facilitated around the social and emotional outcomes that we care about, right? Byron Sanders, the CEO of Big Thought, he's over here, he says social emotional learning is power. It is the power to understand what you are trying to do in life and solve problems around that. So they're gonna be politicians, and they're gonna be running and doing what politicians do, trying to get in the office. They're gonna be folks who are in school boards who decided this is what they're gonna do. And we're gonna have to stand up. And we're gonna have to believe in ourselves to do what's right. Not run away, not write a book, like get out there in the school board, somebody says something, you stand right there and you say that's incorrect.
Okay, the call to action, advocacy, okay? You, the people you know, the people in your networks, say it loud and clear and use the clear vocabulary that these leaders are using so people can understand what we're talking about. I got it. Dr. Samuel, bring us home. And you have had, you know, I hope people read the bios of these exceptional individuals, but you have had, you have been a teacher, you've had a foot in the policy world, more than a foot, you've had 2 feet up to your eyeballs in the policy world, and now, and many other stops that have brought a breadth of experience, really. So where is your call to action? 90 days into your job, where's your call to action?
Yes. So first, I think what I'll say is that there's really 4 things. If we don't do this, there are individual implications for every kid who's trying to navigate their way through, which will then have community implications. If we don't get our individuals right and our communities right, it then, to underscore David's point, this is a national issue. And many of the politicians who are running also struggle with social emotional learning skills. So it's even more important that we make sure our young adults and our young people have it because they're our next generation. But I also want to add a 4th element. This is not just a US issue. This is a global issue. In the last 3 months, my 90 days, we've done 2 webinars where we've had over 80 countries who join our webinars. And if we don't get this right, the same thing that we've seen in math and literacy, other countries will use our research, they will take our practice, and all good things. We want to share, we want a better world, but we will get eclipsed because we're too busy playing politics. So the implications are huge, which leads me to, beyond advocacy, get out and vote. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but pay attention to your local elections because elections have consequences, and boy, have we paid them in the last however long. Get out and vote, and truly pay attention to what these candidates are campaigning on because it matters. And it doesn't just impact us with kids, it impacts the communities that you live in, it impacts our nation as a whole. So if we want a better society and a better world, we better start standing up to this issue and not only advocating, but carrying that down to the polls and voting accordingly. Just to leave you with the numbers again, there's 36 gubernatorial elections. More than half of the nation's governors will turn over in November. There's over 435 legislative seats up for grabs. Many of those governors appoint the state chiefs if they're not elected in. If you don't think education and what's going to happen impacts us, it's time to wake up if we haven't ever before, and to stand up.
Thank you very much. Thanks to these experts. Please take the time after we get off the stage and ask them questions you want. It's remarkable to have them here. It's been an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.